afternoon, and welcome to Data Security and Data Destruction, Continuing Needs in Your Move to the Cloud. We're really excited today to have such a big group with us. I'm Angie Yazelitis, and I'll be your facilitator for today's session. This webinar is actually the first in 2016 from Reclamere, so if you haven't already, please be sure to let us know if you would like to be included in future webinar invites. As always, I just want to start with a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be presented to you in conversational format, and what we'll do is we'll open up for additional questions at the end of the session. So please feel free to send over questions using that feature on your GoToWebinar panel. We will also follow up with all registrants and attendees to answer any questions that we may not have time to address, and to provide an additional information paper on today's topic. I also want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will send that link to you in our follow-up so that you can share the information with other members of your team. Once again, I am very proud to introduce you to Reclamere and certainly to our expert speaker, Angie Singer-Keating. For those of you who have joined us before, you know that Reclamere is a leader in data security, data destruction, offering a full range of specialized IT asset management and information security services, and that they offer several educational opportunities throughout the year. As the CEO of Reclamere, Angie has a broad and diversified background with over 20+ years of experience specializing in computer forensics, data destruction, security incident response, IT risk management, and systems auditing. She provides consultancy services in e-discovery and litigation support, forensic analysis, data breach response, and compliance and risk management services. Angie is the chief architect of Reclamere's proprietary data destruction process. She holds multiple certifications, as you can see on your screen. She is actively involved with the National Association for Information Destruction, which is better known as NAID, where she is a 3-time Member of the Year award recipient, former Certification Roles Committee Chair, and she is currently the active treasurer. She also sits on the board of directors of the Ben Franklin Technology Partnership and proudly serves as an adjunct faculty for the Pennsylvania Bar Institute. She earned a degree in electrical engineering technology from Pennsylvania State University. Thanks again, Angie, for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, you're most welcome, Angie, and as always, it's so great to be able to do these sessions with you.
Well, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. For all of you, you can see the full agenda on the screen for today. We will be covering key points regarding an organization's decision to move to the cloud. And we'll talk about from the time that you make that decision through selecting your vendor and proper disposition of retired assets to really what to remember when providing employee cloud security training. Angie, many people feel like the term cloud can mean different things to different people. Can you start us out today by laying a foundation for what we mean when we talk about moving to the cloud?
Well, the cloud is very complex in the fact that we can have several different ways of being in the cloud. The first and most simple way that many of us understand is that from the time that maybe we were using Hotmail or we were using America Online Mail way back in the dark ages of the early 2000s, late 90s, we were in the cloud. That is something known as software as a service. So if you use Gmail, Google Apps for Business, if you are using Office 365, you are using software as a service and your data is in the cloud. So when I hear people say, oh, we have nothing in the cloud, we'll never go to the cloud, many of them haven't thought about the fact that in many, many businesses, they already are there. Another very popular one would be QuickBooks Online. Another one would be Salesforce.com. And then we also have platform as a service. And so that is really popular with companies that do their own software development, website design, where they're actually building and creating and coding in a cloud environment where another organization can really give them ramp up in computing power, can give them ramp up in storage in a very, very fast way, so that they can be very agile in their design. And then we also have infrastructure as a service. So this is basically where you are moving or utilize all of the hardware at a data center that's not within your organization. And then we have many combinations and hybrids of almost every one of these models. So I think that the most important thing that we look at in all of these, the very first thing is something I like to call, dude, where's my data? You know, right now it can be very confusing because many of our IT service providers will come to us and they will say, hey, we're doing data storage in the cloud, or companies are starting to offer to data archive or store information. And sometimes that creates a problem from a legal perspective of where does my data actually reside? And this is a really, really big concern when we get into things like redundant systems. So when we talk about the very high-end cloud service providers, they may be having redundant systems in other countries and some other things like that that we're going to talk about later. So you really need to understand when you're purchasing these services, are you actually purchasing directly from the place where your data is going to be stored, or is this maybe an Amazon cloud where the service is being resold and then someone else is white labeling it and they're turning around and reselling it? When there are incidents, security incidents, this can be an incredibly challenging issue. So some of the things that we really need to focus on are retaining specialized legal counsel. This is especially critical when we talk about any type of intellectual property where we may be writing our own code out in a cloud, and what happens if that cloud service provider goes bankrupt and your crown jewels of intellectual property on the software you've just developed are now not even available to you. We also need to understand data portability. Every service cloud provider, when we talk about software as a service, we talk about the Salesforce.com of the world. When we're signing up for the service, there's a whole lot of hype about, yeah, if you want to leave our service, you can just migrate your data somewhere. Well, when you hear the words migrate your data, there are a whole lot of red flags that need to go up, because migrating data is a whole lot more complex. And oftentimes it can be made to sound as simple as moving data from your laptop to a USB. Then we also need to understand the actual infrastructure itself. So, when we go to the cloud, are we sharing the physical servers? Yes, most definitely you are. Is it a virtualized environment? And there are very specialized clouds where, you're not even sharing the physical devices. That's a highly, highly expensive way to go. And then finally, the vendor's business viability. There are many, many companies that are getting into the data archiving, data storage, data center business, and they're growing these businesses with the sole purpose of them being acquired for a lot of money from someone else. So when your cloud service provider gets acquired, are you still going to have the same rights to your data? Are you still going to have the same uptime? Are you still going to be able to even access your data if the organization should go under without any kind of notice? So these are all of the kind of things and some of the fundamental concepts of these different types of cloud service offerings.
Well, it makes sense then, when I hear from you that selecting a cloud provider can be a scary process for some organizations. I think about especially when they're concerned with security and they're fearful of making a wrong decision. Can you provide us with some guidelines that can take away some of that fear when they're actually making that initial selection?
Absolutely. I think some of the most important things to understand right off the bat is that the cloud and moving to a managed service provider is no more or less inherently risky than keeping everything internal to your organization. I like to say, at a very basic fundamental level, cloud is nothing but geography. So the same types of security that you would implement in your own organization are some of the bare minimums that you would ever want to expect out of a cloud provider. The same things as how are they patching their systems? How are they training their staff? What types of penetration testing and security auditing are they doing? And so this due diligence is absolutely crucial, because once you've gone through this expensive and very time-consuming process of migrating your data or migrating systems, migrating infrastructure, and then you find out that these things have not been really assessed, that presents a big challenge, because ultimately, no matter where your data resides, you are still liable. You are still responsible. So if you happen to be an organization, I hear this a lot with medical records in physician practices. I hear this a lot with insurance companies where they're using an outsourced system. I've even heard it with financial services who are using third parties to manage their online banking. Say, oh, well, we use a cloud provider, so they're responsible for all of that. No, at the end of the day, if there's a data breach, your clients and the regulators are coming to you. You will be the ones on the news. You will be the ones in the spotlight. And the excuse of, well, this is my vendor's fault, doesn't hold water legally. It's not going to hold water from a PR perspective, because at the end of the day, who chose the vendor? You did. So you're really marrying this organization, and due diligence is absolutely crucial. Now, that can be really hard because, small companies, when they're getting ready to move to the Amazon cloud or the Google Drive, Google Apps for Business, or they're migrating to the AT&T cloud, Azure cloud with Microsoft. If we were to call them or look at the service level agreement and say, we want to be able to come and audit you anytime we want. And, some of these other kinds of key due diligence activities that we're used to doing with businesses of like size, they may laugh at you internally, but you'll never know because they're never going to call you back or respond to you. So what these very large organizations have done is that they have gotten third-party attestation. Folks that are familiar with the National Association of Information know that we have the AAA NAID certification, and that has independent validation. Well, we have the same thing in information security. One of them is the SSAE 16. For any of you that may be on the call where you're still hearing the SOC Type 1, Type 2 audits and certifications, those are now antiquated, and SSAE 16 has taken the is now the recognized standard. And understanding that SSAE 16 looks into both financial viability, financial controls, as well as the information security controls of the organization. The ISO 27000 series of standards, these are also standards that purely look at information systems controls, information systems management, and so larger organizations should provide that to you. Now, if you're dealing with a smaller cloud service provider, then really the only way to do any real due diligence on them, if you're not a certified information systems auditor yourself, is that you want to see an audit report from an independent third party where a CISA, Certified Information Systems Auditor, or a CISSP, certified individual, has signed off on the report and attested to it. Now, it's really important that it's third party because, unfortunately, there are IT vendors out there who provide the service of configuring firewalls, selling hardware, and then come back and say, oh, and by the way, we will also do a risk assessment for you. That's completely the fox watching the hen house, no separation of duties, no separation of controls, And so we really want to see that they have that third-party attestation. Now, really, it's super important to understand, especially if you're in healthcare or you have healthcare clients and you are a business associate yourself, your cloud service provider is a business associate if they transmit, store, or in any way process or manage healthcare information. Now, there is something called the transition exception, and there are exceptions for double-blind encryption where the cloud service provider does not have the encryption keys and could not look at your data in the cloud even if they wanted to. That's something that we've all become familiar with lately with the San Bernardino issue with the iPhones. But they are still a business associate, and you are still responsible to do proper due diligence on them and document the encryption methodology they're used that will qualify them to fall under those types of safe harbor exceptions. And as we look at selecting the vendor, and we kind of narrow it down to, maybe some of the vendors that we think are going to meet these, these standards that we really have to have, it really then comes down to the service level agreement. And we've talked about already these things about where is my data located. One of the most important things to understand if you are working with a global organization, that the European Union has very different laws regarding privacy. And so if you are a European country and company that is based out of Europe and you hold the information of Europeans and Americans, you can't just decide that you're going to use a cloud storage provider and move all of that European citizen data into an American cloud. The United States does not meet the safe harbor requirements for the European Union, and they are very serious about not letting their citizens' data out of the country. So there are international issues to consider when you're looking at where your data is going to be housed. The other issue around where the data is located is that if we're in areas where the data may be replicated, let's say the primary data center is in Atlanta, Georgia, but the things that make data centers so powerful and such a great choice is that we have redundancies built in. We can flip a switch and have more computing power, but all of this requires systems that are on different fiber optics pathways, that are on in different geographic locations. So if we've got a data center in an earthquake-prone zone, we probably want to replicate and be someplace maybe on the East Coast where we're going to have less risk of earthquake. Well, it's the same thing when we look at replication into countries where there may be known state-sponsored cyber threats. And unfortunately, that's something that hits the news all too often. So again, these are things where in the security or in the service level agreement, you need to be able to restrict where your data can be located. Another thing that's super important is that your service level agreement truly needs to acknowledge and explicitly state that you retain exclusive ownership of all of your data. Now, that's self-evident when we're talking about moving our data to the cloud. One of the challenges where this is extremely complex and really needs specialized legal counsel is in the area of where software development is being done in the cloud. Retaining the ownership rights to any of your intellectual property that you develop at someone else's infrastructure, at someone else's cloud is absolutely crucial. And anyone who's ever looked at any of the Facebook or some of the other social media user agreements will see that in some of those user agreements, there's built in that once you put your data into their system, you lose ownership of it. So when we're talking about developing software, developing applications in cloud, an important thing to look at is to have code escrow so that your source code and very important intellectual property is also held in escrow somewhere, that if this cloud service provider should go under, you still have your source code in a very safe place that you can have access, and that the cloud service provider has absolutely no interest in any of the intellectual property for anything that you are anything that you're developing out there. So, and we can move into the next slide, Angie.
So, Angie, what I always hear from your team is that the fun actually starts when you're ready to move the data to the cloud. What I know is it's not like the snapping your fingers and suddenly the data's moved, although we probably wish it was that way. Are there steps organizations can be aware of to actually make that migration process easier?
Absolutely. Failure to plan is planning to fail. And even the simplest migration, let's say you're moving from spreadsheets in your office to Salesforce.com, or the very high-end, very highly complex migrations of you're a hospital and you're going to move your in-house electronic health record system out to one of the big managed clouds with the very large healthcare services vendors. There has to be a very strong change management plan that addresses risk at every step of the way, so that all of the potential pitfalls, from technical to legal, can all be discussed, can be planned for. One of the biggest challenges that we see, even when people have a great plan, is how do we get our data there? The internet, if we think of it as a pipe, when we're going to migrate large amounts of data somewhere else, then there are real constraints on the bandwidth of the pipe of the internet. So we don't want to be in a situation where we're trying to force, the amount of data, as a water analogy, coming out of a fire hose into a garden hose. The other thing that we have to think about with bandwidth is that, okay, if we're using our bandwidth to migrate data, that potentially could be bandwidth that you don't have for your normal everyday business operations. So are you going to run second and third shifts that are going to be working on this migration? All of this needs to be taken into account. Now, the other thing is that moving our data to the cloud means that we still have to have in place really good, strong access controls and system configuration. So again, we can't think of this as just a ginormous data dump. We have to think of all the same things that we would think of if we were building systems internally from the ground up. The most important thing is to recognize those areas that could create business interruption, which in the case of healthcare can be literally life-threatening. And one of the best ways to do that is to understand your data criticality. The only way to know your data criticality is to have performed risk assessments and to have classified your data. So that's really where we get into an area that if we're not properly looking at our overall business objective and what is the most important information in our organization, and really truly plan seriously for that migration, not only will we have a potentially failed cloud migration project, but we could literally have our business crippled or completely interrupted. So one of the ways that we avoid that interruption is to make sure that our change management plan for the migration includes really strong testing. Now, again, because of the complexity of the cloud and the so many different ways of quote-unquote being in the cloud, whether it's infrastructure, platform, or software, or you're just merely using it as a data archive, you really have to understand testing, because the last thing that we want to do is to be making assumptions that data is properly migrated, we're out there in the cloud, we're ready to roll, and we flip that switch before we have done a really good job of designing the implementation itself, testing that implementation at many points along the way, not just, okay, well, we'll get everything implemented, then we'll do a test. No, there are many key elements, there are many key project milestones that a good project manager with the change management plan should be inserting testing at those milestones. Then from the testing, we want to troubleshoot. We want to document every single thing that we find in our troubleshooting. We want to refine what we find from the troubleshooting. And then we basically want to repeat this as an iterative process until we're at smooth sailing, and we know that we can just go ahead and we know we're going to function out there. Obviously, there are going to be hiccups. That is just an absolute given. But we can do a lot to minimize those complications and those potential risks by good planning, good testing. Next.
Very interesting. Angie, is it true that one of the most critical steps is one that you find your clients don't pay enough attention to, and is actually one where there are a lot of potential vulnerabilities, and that's really when it's time to get rid of any outdated or unnecessary equipment as they begin to migrate to the cloud?
Absolutely. And as we continue to work with more and more and more clients, even ones that have a really good change management program, the disposition part is either not acknowledged in the plan. If it's acknowledged, it's maybe a sentence or two about old servers will be returned to leasing company. Old servers will be sent for disposition by the leasing company. Old servers will be destroyed and sent to a recycler, if they're even that specific. And so the disposition plan should be as well thought out with timelines and milestones in how you're going to decommission this equipment. So as we look at this equipment coming out of service, one of our first challenges is how do we get rid of all of this data? When I use the analogy that a single computer hard drive contains the equivalent information of one tractor trailer load of bankers' boxes of documents, it's almost unfathomable the amount of data that are on these hard drive arrays in these data centers. One of the recent projects that we worked on had thousands of drives that had to come out of dozens of servers. And every one of these drives had to have the data destroyed. Now, for my friends in the only way to destroy data is to shred the drive world, that doesn't fly, because shredding drives coming out of leased equipment is like returning your car at the end of the lease without the transmission. There are huge financial penalties, and it is not even something that is feasible. So a couple things on this particular project happened that were so disturbing. The first one was that, first of all, this was a client of ours for whom we had done security risk assessment work. We had also been involved in some of their security incidents where we investigated potential or suspected data breaches. And we also were, they're also our client in terms of us doing all of their sanitization and disposition on all of their other IT assets. So when it came time to decommission 3 data centers across 3 of their facilities, and they needed to return this leased equipment, we gave them guidance on what our thoughts were. And we were told that the leasing company had assured them that they had a vendor that was going to handle all of the data destruction and that this vendor was certified. Now, there are many certifications out there, but in our world, the only one that counts when it comes to data security is NAID AAA certified destruction. And so we said to our clients, this is the certification that you need to validate that they have. We showed them how to go out on the NAID website and validate that a company has their certification. You can also validate whether or not they have downstream data. And so we talked to the client about this, and the client went back to the leasing company, and the leasing company said, yes, the leasing company is XYZ, and they are NAID certified. Well, it turned out that they were NAID members, but they were not NAID certified. They did not have downstream data insurance. In fact, probably no professional liability insurance that would really have protected this client in this particular type of engagement. So thankfully, the client said, you know what, leasing company, that's not good enough. We work with this company called Reclamere. They're NAID certified. They do have downstream data insurance, and so we will destroy all of the data prior to returning it to you. So had that company not had that knowledge, I am confident that these servers would have gone back to this organization with a very high focus on resale of equipment. I can tell you that this project for us was a very long project where we ran shifts overnight and on weekends to properly sanitize these drives. Now, another challenge with this is the fact that in any time that you're going to be moving equipment, any time that you're going to put them through the taxing process of the sanitization overwrite, where they're going to be running for hours at a time, you will have failed hard drives. And so one of the important things to have in your disposition plan is how are we going to deal with the hard drives that fail the wiping process or fail the forensic quality control step. And so really there are three options, and every organization has to assess their own risk. Very, very hesitant anytime I see folks who say, there's a black and white binary solution to anything. The first one, and the preferred one, is that you would choose to physically destroy the drives that did not sanitize, and you would go ahead and pay the leasing company the penalty. Now, in our world of tight budgets, especially tight budgets in healthcare, that can be rather expensive when we talk about 10 to 15% of thousands of drives. Fortunately for this client, we were down in the 3 to 5% failure rate. The second option that this client literally considered, not at our recommendation, was that they would degauss the drives, which means to apply an incredibly high magnetic field to the drives, which destroys a crucial component inside the drive. The data is not accessible. It is still there, but it is not accessible. And it makes the hard drive still look like it works, like a real normal hard drive, but the drive will no longer work. The problem with this is that, first of all, if the leasing company realizes it's what you've done, it is a form of physical destruction because it does destroy an internal component of the drive, and that you're going to end up being charged for them anyway. The other issue with that is that server hard drives, depending on what kind they are, can have an unbelievably, very strong casing that requires very, very strong magnetic fields, where the degaussing may end up being ineffective because of that. And then the final option is that they can accept the risk and choose to return the very small amount of drive, with the rationale being that since these drives came out of arrays, which are very large bundles of drives acting as one single drive, that one single drive without any of the other components of the array would be enormously challenging to actually recover, and then not only recover, but then reconstruct. This particular client decided to accept the risk and to return them. The most important component of all of this was that we had full documentation. The other great documentation we had for the client was that any drives that showed up back at their at the leasing company where the leasing company said, let's say, oh, you had 500 failed hard drives and we're going to charge you. We had full documentation to show exactly which drives failed, how they failed, and had them identified. So it really gave the client really strong evidence to be able to go back to the leasing company and say, yeah, no, we did not have 500. In fact, we had less than 50. So, so those are some of the things that really have to be factored into the planning. So we can go on to the next slide, Ange.
Okay. The disposition planning is always so interesting to me. I know you mentioned this already, but you can't help but hear so much about breaches. And I think, you know, for most of us, we do think they're tied to the cloud. But I know you talk a lot about the root causes of breaches and that rarely they are tied to the cloud. Is that true?
Yeah, you know, when the statistics, like in this particular slide, are analyzed, when they're doing the analysis to come up with these statistics, notice there really isn't anything that says, well, hacking happens more often in the cloud. Malware happens more often in on-site infrastructure. There's no designation like that because systems are systems are systems. Hackers do not care where your data lives. They only care about how to get into those systems. So when we look at this slide, it can be a little misleading in making us think that these breaches are the result of one of these items. The vast majority of these breaches happen with a combination of these types of situations. Many of them will start with an error in configuration of infrastructure. So Active Directory on a Windows server being improperly configured. Poor patching of systems, which then allows malware to be released into the environment, which malware then phones back to active hackers who then use the malware to come into the system and then begin to move around. And then, of course, we have the social aspect. Someone calls a company and says, hey, I'm with tech support with Microsoft, and your system administrator told me to get your password so I can fix your system before it crashes beyond all hope. And then, of course, we have the physical, you know, dropping of a USB in a parking lot to see if somebody will pick it up, bring it into an organization, and plug it into a device just to see what's on it. That is a very common way, and it is almost too irresistible for staff, especially if they have not been trained on it. So it's just as easy for someone to drop a USB drive in a small company that happens to be a subcontractor to a defense contractor, drop a USB in their parking lot, as it is to go to the Google data center location and drop a thumb drive in their parking lot. If there are not properly trained employees, there are not proper security controls in place, either one of those organizations may be just as vulnerable. They may be just as vulnerable as the other. So those are really, you know, root causes that have nothing to do with cloud or not cloud. This is a slide that always troubles me. I use this slide in one of the seminars that I teach with the Pennsylvania Bar Institute. I've been doing this now, I think this will be my 4th or 5th year with them as part of their adjunct faculty. And the numbers on this slide only ever change by, you know, a couple percentage points either way. 96% of attacks were not difficult. Now, if you're a non-technical person, excuse me, a non-technical person, excuse me, I'm so sorry, everyone. For non-technical people, the media can make it sound like these attacks were very complex. Unfortunately, most of the time they aren't. So it's really important, regardless of where our data is, that organizations understand this. And so, Angie, if you could go to the next slide and kind of talk about some of the recent breaches, that would be a big help to me right now.
I was just going to say that, absolutely. So it's interesting because we are all familiar with some of these breaches that they've been all over the news. We've seen them in the newspapers. We certainly see them online. And, you recognize the names, the Home Depot, Target, Sony, iCloud. But the fact is that the causes really had nothing to do with the fact that these organizations are working in the cloud. As far as the iCloud hack, it really had to do with lack of two-factor authentication, which I know that Angie will talk a little bit more about. But really, it's, having two ways to identify yourself when there's a change in any system. The other thing was hackers using phishing emails to gain access from a third-party vendor. And so basically what happens is they're able to get credentials. And the reason that happens is a couple of things. One of the things that's not on here is the lack of proper training about phishing emails, to the employees, lack of cloud data encryption, and certainly end-to-end encryption. And one or all of those things are really what happened in terms of Target and the Home Depot. And then certainly improper network security precautions is what happened with Sony. So when we think about, when you're choosing your cloud vendor and you're thinking all these things with security, you have to just as much be thinking about what you're doing internally with your employees when it comes to these cloud-related breaches that aren't really cloud-caused breaches.
Angie, those are absolutely great points. And, I'm really big on anytime I teach, I want to have people have really actionable takeaways. And so one of the most important actionable takeaways that I want everyone who is on this call, I want them to go out and Google how to enable two-factor authentication, whether it's on their personal Facebook page, their business pages, their LinkedIn pages, any type of social media for their corporation, for their own email. Two-factor authentication is the process whereby you type in your username, like we're all familiar, you type in your password. However, after your password, you're not automatically launched into the application. You then receive a code on your cell phone, and you have to enter that specific code, and it will be different every single time. When you get emails from people where their account has obviously been hijacked, that's a clue that they don't have two-factor authentication turned on. So, super, super important. Anyone can follow up with an email. We're going to have all the contact information in here. And if you want any kind of help or you want us to send you any kind of link, but I promise you, if you Google or you go to YouTube and do the search, you will find out how to enable two-factor authentication for everything under the sun that right now has two-factor authentication.
And, I talked a little bit about that. You and I talk about this a lot, that our employees are our greatest asset, but that without knowledge, they are also a vulnerability. And I know that you personally feel like employee training is a vital part of cloud migration. Are there specific topics that just have to be trained each and every year, or are there specific topics that are even more vital when you're working in a cloud environment?
Again, I don't believe that there is anything more inherently risky or inherently more important when your systems are in the cloud versus when they're in your own organization. One of the things that's most important is when people say, well, our data's in the cloud, so it's secure, and we don't have to worry about training our staff, or we don't have to worry as much about security because our data is there. Well, how do you get to your data? How do you work with your data? you have computers at your desk that log into the cloud. Well, if your computer can log into the cloud, then if your computer has malware on it, your malware is going with you into the cloud. Now, not that it's going to infect a very well managed and highly secure cloud, but they now have your credentials if that malware happens to be a keylogger. So for instance, your salespeople go into salesforce.com without two-factor authentication, and they put in their username and password, they put in the URL beforehand, so now the keylogger has all of your credentials. With two-factor authentication turned on, they may get all those credentials, but they don't have the final piece, which is the code that just came across that salesperson's cell phone. So it's still super important to have two-factor authentication. It's still super important that they understand about not clicking on types of links. It's really important that they understand not to fall victim to certain types of email and that we train them. It's also very, very important that we have not only very good antivirus on our computers, but that we have another layer of any type of malware detection. So at our organization, we have an antivirus program, but then we also layer on top of that something called Malwarebytes, which actively goes out and looks for malware in a different way than our antivirus. And then finally, no matter how your staff are connecting to your data in the cloud or working with the data in the cloud, they really need to only be on your approved devices. Because, again, we go back to this complex topic of bring your own device, and it is absolutely crucial that your staff have been trained in acceptable use. It's absolutely crucial, especially when the data is in the cloud, and they can access it from anywhere, that you have really, really good policies when someone leaves your employment. We need to turn off their access to the cloud. In many organizations, when the infrastructure is in-house, we turn off their Active Directory access and they're done. Well, you know, at many organizations today, we have many different accesses we have to terminate when someone leaves, whether it's good terms or bad terms. Well, we have to terminate Salesforce. We have to terminate email. We may have to terminate some other type of accounting system. These are all things that we need to update our policies and procedures, especially our security procedures and HR procedures, to make sure that we get that crucial point right.
Absolutely. And the fact is, they're still using devices. So I know we already talked about, disposition, but those employees have been using, disposition is an ongoing need, not just at the time that they migrate to the cloud, correct?
Absolutely. Think of how many times, just for the sake of convenience, we will click that little box that says, remember my machine, remember this device, so that when we tap on Facebook, when we tap on LinkedIn, when we go to our QuickBooks Online, we don't have to go through the whole process of security questions and everything else. In some cases, we don't even have to put our password in. It's right there in a cookie. So when we dispose of these devices, and those apps are still on these devices with those credentials, those cause an incredible amount of problems. So it used to be, or still is in companies where the entire infrastructure is inside, that if you weren't on the internal network, but your credentials were still live, it didn't matter because the person who got a hold of that device did not have access to the internal network. Well, when you're in the cloud, your internal network is now directly tied to the cloud, and in many cases, for much of what we do in the cloud, you don't even have to be on your internal network. You can be sitting in a hotel in Sydney, Australia. So it's super critical that on the disposition side, that just because data's in the cloud doesn't mean that disposition needs now change. They're actually more crucial than ever before.
Absolutely. So always with your webinars, there's so much important information to cover, but I know that it's important for you to leave time for questions. So we're right about 10 minutes here for questions. So in summary, making sure that you have a plan to address these key points on the screen can ease a lot of fears and potential headaches when migrating to the cloud. You know, with proper vendor selection, you taught us to trust, but verify what you're being told by your vendors. Certainly having that strong service level agreement and having somebody who, you know, really knows what they're talking about, be working on that. Creating detailed change management plans, doing redundant testing, doing it again if you need to, and certainly not forgetting to pay attention to your disposition plans, certainly not just at the time of migration, but, you know, throughout the life of your business, really. And all of those steps can certainly lessen your breach vulnerabilities. So what I'd like to do at this time, and I know we have some questions that are already coming over, but we'll start taking some questions from the audience, and we'll just kind of start with the first one here. Okay, here's some additionals. All right, so the first one, my IT team says never move to the cloud, it's not secure. Angie, how would you respond to that?
Well, not to be a smart aleck, but I would ask your IT team how many of them have a master's level or PhD degree in computer science or security from MIT or Stanford. If none of them do, then it's probably not a good assumption that your data is more secure than a tier 1 cloud or a tier 1 data center. Now, with that said, that's not to say there aren't excellent, amazing IT people out there. But the time has come where the difference between operational security, operational IT and IT security have now become two very distinct professions. You would not want your general practitioner cracking open your brain. You would want a brain surgeon. You would not want the dermatologist to be the one necessarily that was doing open heart surgery. We specialize because of the complexities. The other thing is that the threat landscape is constantly changing. So people that are very, very good at whether it is programming, whether it is configuring networks and keeping them running, that in and of itself takes an unbelievable amount of expertise. To expect them to be security experts on top of that is really not realistic. Now, that is one of the other reasons why it's so important that you're looking to the tier level, the tier 1 level service providers. Not that there aren't mid-tier and local businesses that have data centers that you can't count on, but there is a huge dearth of really good qualified IT security people out there, and the reality is that the very best and the very brightest are making incredible amounts of money at very, very large organizations. And so when we're going to the step of giving custody of our data to someone else, we want to really make sure that those folks have the expertise.
Makes sense. Okay, here's another one. If you are using a SOC, I don't know if you pronounce it SOC, Angie, 1 type 2 audit, what audit should it be replaced with?
It should be replaced with an SSAE 16. Now, there's a transition phase, and there is also a catch-up period. So neither of these attestations, whether it's SSAE 16 or SOC, are easy or inexpensive to get. They're incredibly expensive. So many organizations, if they have not been forced to go to SSAE 16 yet, they will be, whether it's through their insurance carriers, whether it is because of their clients demanding it. But as the SOC 1 and SOC Type 2 fade away, they will have to migrate. Understand that SOC 1 and SOC 2 were designed to look at the financial controls of a business for the financial viability and security of the organization. SSAE 16 took all of the financial controls of SOC Type 1 and Type 2 and then rolled them into SSAE 16 with all of the elements of IT security, because of the fact that the way that we manage money today and the way that we manage financial security is through IT systems that house that data. And so it's a natural commingling of standards, controls, auditing, methodology, because data is the currency of the 21st century.
Okay. All right, here's a good one. I asked for some clarification in our agreement regarding security, and am getting a lot of pushback. What kind of language do you recommend I use when communicating with this potential vendor?
Well, the first language I would use is, what about this agreement and what about your security are you averse to giving or sharing with us? That pushback in and of itself, it can be a red flag. Very much like I tell covered entities, healthcare providers. If you're asking a business associate for third-party attestation of their risk assessment and someone says, what is that? Or someone says, well, no, we don't hand that out. Those are big red flags, and you may want to consider looking elsewhere. So when you're getting pushback around the security portion, what I recommend is asking them to please become very detailed in what aspects of the pushback they're giving you. And then I also advise you to consider talking with your legal counsel to see if the risk regarding the information that you're going to be giving them custody of, what is the level of risk that presents to your organization? Because not every organization is giving pushback is a problem. Maybe you're asking for audit rights to go in and audit at any time, and they're so big that they could never in a million years allow every one of their clients to come in and audit unannounced at any time. So those are the places where you're gonna negotiate. But understand, case law has not happened. Laws are really not keeping up with technology, and so we're really in kind of the Wild West of how things will shake out when cloud fails begin to happen more and more because of these issues around service level agreements.
Okay. So I'm going to take two more questions because we have several coming over. Let's do the one right there. Sorry, give me just a minute. Okay. How about our IT vendor who helps manage our network? They do our monthly checkup. The employees can log into our network from anywhere. What happens when one of their employees leaves? Should I be then changing all of my passwords? This could be cumbersome as they have gone through some changes lately.
Wow, that is a great question. And we should give a prize for best question on webinars. That is an excellent question. And that is a really important thing to understand with your vendor before you've even selected them. Now, I'm going to assume that you're asking because you already have this vendor in place. So it would be the same type of situation as what you would have if you had an internal person. With whether it's managed security with their staff or it's your own internal security staff, I highly recommend having a team-based password keeper for which your organization, someone at a high level, holds the administrator password to the password keeper, so that no matter who comes or goes in your organization, you have a very easy way to go in to see every password, that anybody has access to, and that way you'll understand those systems that need to have password changes. I would absolutely make sure that when you're talking about the scope of the engagement, you're talking about the service level agreement for managed services, that they will change passwords for all systems within a defined time period for their own for all employees who have had access to your systems. Absolutely, absolutely crucial. And, you know, Reclamere has been in the position just for internal IT admin staff where, you know, we are asked to come on site and actually sit through the termination process of system administrators to make sure we get all passwords, to make sure that those passwords actually work before the person leaves, or in the event that the person basically says, you know, guess what, I'm out of here, I don't have to cooperate with anything you say, to have security people right there on standby to make sure systems are locked down and look for anomalies after the person has left for a particular period of time.
Okay. All right, we're going to do one more question. I know it's one after, but we'll take this one too. What is the difference between a surety bond and downstream data insurance, or PLP? Would those cover the customer in the same way? Can either one be used?
I absolutely positively cannot give you anything but my opinion. I am not an insurance expert. I am not a broker. I have no expertise in insurance. I can simply tell you, as a business owner in my own company, I have various types of insurance, but I have downstream data because it is specifically for my industry. My own insurance broker, who obviously does not sell me downstream data, I get that through the Association Management Organization, or Association Information Management Organization that manages that. He sat in on the phone call with the downstream data folks, and at the end of the call said, yeah, this insurance covers something that you don't have. Understand that most bonding, most employee misconduct, those types of dishonesty policies, they are covering tangible goods. So if an employee walks out with a hard drive, my employee dishonesty bond only covers the value of a hard drive. So if that is a, let's say they actually walk out with a USB stick, the actual value of the USB stick used may be 50 cents, but the data on that may be worth millions and millions of dollars, either on the black market and the dark web, or it could cost someone millions and millions of dollars in fines. So my insurance coverages are about the real types of losses that I will have around the value of the information. The other thing to remember about professional liability insurance, also cyber liability. Many cyber liability policies only cover data that resides on your network, either your own data, so that if you would have a breach of your own data and let's say your employees wanted to sue you, or if you have the data of your clients on your own systems. Now, in the case of data archiving, scanning, some of those things, then yes, you want to have very specific professional liability that's going to cover that. So those are all of the nuances of insurance. And what I can tell you is that I have learned all of this the hard way and through the school of hard knocks. So the last way you want to find out about what is and what is not covered is that way. So make sure you understand the difference between the value of the information, the regulatory potential penalties, the litigation aspects, and whether or not we're covering the tangible or the intangible types of things that we handle.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there, folks, with respect to everybody's time. I just do want to mention that if we didn't get to somebody's question, we do have them here, and we will make sure that Angie can answer them. I want to thank you so much for participating. I do want to invite you to go to the webinar, to the website, www.reclamere.com, and certainly we'd love to have you join us for data security over coffee at the blog. Angie and Joe Harford do, and you can tune in or you can subscribe to the Reclamere YouTube channel to take part in that. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the recording and following up with all participants over the next few days. You will each receive an informational sheet regarding today's session over the next week or so, and if you would like to reach out to us individually, we would of course love to work with you.